Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another video. It's been about a week since we had our last upload here on the channel, and to keep the content going, I thought a good way to do that would be to kind of go over what is to be expected for the next couple weeks, at least to start June. We're getting into the back half of the typical tornado season in the plains, and it has certainly been an active season thus far. May was very, very active. Over 500 tornado reports across the U.S. in the month of May alone. Basically double what we usually see in the U.S. for the month of May. So a very active month, and there have been a lot of questions over whether or not that would continue into June. So I thought a good way to get a video up here would be to go over what we might be seeing, what we might be able to expect for the next couple of weeks as we go into the latter half of the tornado season. So we're going to take a look just briefly at the upcoming pattern. In the short term, we have a few severe setups coming up. Not necessarily looking into one setup in particular, although we do have some significant severe weather at play for the next few days at least. But we're just going to take a look at the overall pattern here for the next few days, and then we're going to look beyond that, going into some medium and longer range data to see how we might fare going into the middle portion of June at the very least. So just going to kind of be an outline of what we might expect going forward and how we might close out this storm season on the plains. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. As you can see here, we have a few severe setups outlined by the SPC into the next few days. Here is today's outlook. Broad slight risk across much of the high plains from Nebraska southward into West Texas. Little enhanced area there has now been outlined for southwest Kansas into the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles, mostly for severe wind that may persist into the evening as a storm cluster moves into this region. 30% hatched area for severe wind. Not all that uncommon this time of year to see significant severe wind events across the plains into the Midwest. Low-end tornado threat for today, not too much support for tornadic activity. We will take a look at why that's the case here in just a second. And large hail could be a threat as well. So kind of your typical late spring, early summer type setup where you have mostly a wind threat with some other severe hazards possible as well across a fairly wide swath of the plains into the Midwest. Let's go ahead and take a look at tomorrow now. They have drawn in an enhanced risk there for much of Nebraska into North Kansas. Once again, mostly for a significant damaging wind threat. 30% hatched damaging wind risk there across much of Nebraska into northern Kansas for a potential MCS that is expected to develop across that area tomorrow afternoon and evening. Low-end tornado threat once again. Large hail could be a risk. We do have a slight risk down there into West Texas where we could see some large hail and damaging winds from some supercells in that vicinity. And then day 3, we have a marginal risk for parts of the central and southern plains into the Midwest and Ohio River Valley region. Low-end threat at this point. The details are not really all that clear on the day 3 outlook for Monday, but we'll have some more clarity here over the next couple of days. So kind of your typical late spring pattern, and the reason is for this background pattern. We have seen in much of May these big old troughs starting to make their way into the U.S. Over and over again. Very active jet stream, and that has ceased somewhat. So here's the 12Z NAM from this morning at 500 millibars. So our morning run of the NAM here in the mid-levels of the atmosphere. And you can see that we have had a change from what we've been seeing through much of May, those big old deep digging troughs across the U.S., to more of a zonal flow pattern, mostly just west to east flow across much of the U.S. with some little waves embedded within that flow. You can see a little bit of a wave here across the west coast. Very limited enhancement of the flow associated with this wave. We do have a trough here over the northern plains expected to move off to the east here with time over the next couple of days, and some enhanced flow here across the Gulf Coast. Some ridging starting to take place here across the Gulf Coast. You can see the upward bowing of those height contours. So not much in the way of any waves down there, but we do have some slightly enhanced flow, which has been enough to initiate some storms down in these regions the past couple of days. A little bit of a ridge here across the east coast that has developed as well as a big old trough moves out here into the Atlantic. Some ridging here behind it across the east coast. But so mostly a more quiescent pattern, relatively speaking, from what we saw in May, which was a very active, very wavy jet stream here across much of the U.S. That is expected to persist into the next few days. You can see here just mostly zonal flow, some little waves here embedded within the flow as we go forward here, some slightly enhanced belt of flow rounding the ridge here that is centered over Mexico into the Gulf. So that is going to allow a severe threat to persist there going into the latter portion of the weekend and early next week. A little bit of a shortwave here across the northern plains. A little bit more of a substantial trough back here across the northwest that begins to take shape going into the early portion of the week. A few days ago, we were expecting a severe weather event across the northern plains associated with this troughing, but that has backed off. The model support for that has backed off over the last couple of days. We just don't have enough moisture and instability up in this region ahead of this trough to support a robust threat for severe weather. We could see some down the line into the middle portion of the week, but for these next few days, not expecting to see much associated with this trough, even though it is quite a potent trough here. Nice negatively tilted shortwave here across southern Canada into the northern plains. Down here to the south, a very late spring type pattern, very much zonal flow, slight enhancements to the flow in there, but a very quiescent pattern, 20 to 30 knots of flow aloft down there across the southern plains. Moisture, not too much of an issue this time of year. As you might expect, not too much. We're going to need that moisture already in the plains because with this somewhat more quiescent pattern, not expecting robust low-level cyclone development associated with this mid and upper level pattern. Here's our surface low pattern. Not much going on here. A little bit of surface low development there across southeast Colorado going into this evening and tomorrow, but mostly just broad cyclonic flow out here across these regions. Basically somewhat daily weak cyclogenesis there across the central high plains across eastern Colorado, which may help initiate storms across these regions out to its east, Nebraska, down into the Texas Panhandle region over the next few days, but nothing really that catches the eye as far as a really tight surface cyclone that we've seen often here in May that has gotten the job done for these bigger tornado events. So mostly a quiescent pattern here, just broad cyclonic troughing on the lee side of the Rockies, at least in the short term. And then as that trough moves into that more substantial trough, moves into the northern plains, strong surface low development there across southern Canada. Again, not much of an issue here for the northern plains until perhaps maybe going into the Great Lakes there toward the middle portion of the week, but we'll get to that here as it arrives. As far as moisture goes, we already have some moisture here across the plains. Not always that much of an issue is moisture this time of year. 60s dew points up into the central high plains and Midwest, with 70s dew points relegated down there into parts of Texas. Not all that surprising. That our best moisture there closer to the Gulf. We're going to try to continue to bring that moisture northward over the next several days. Some 60s dew points here up into Nebraska, South Dakota by late this evening. And then we get those, you can see those MCSs, those clusters of storms working their way into that moisture plume there across the central plains. But that moisture going to stick around for much of the next few days. We get those 70s dew points up into southwest Kansas, at least on this NAM run, by tomorrow afternoon and evening. This is at 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time tomorrow. So robust moisture, not going to be too much of an issue, especially for southern portions of the risk area. Mid-60s dew points up here all the way to the Canadian border. So that could support a severe threat up for areas to the north up there into the Dakotas and Nebraska. You can see those MCSs, those clusters, eating their way into the moisture there going into tomorrow and Monday morning. That moisture kind of maintains itself, very tight dry line maintains itself across the Texas Panhandle, Texas South Plains into West Texas there, as well as up to the north across the Kansas-Colorado border region going into Monday. So all in all, the ingredients are there for a kind of daily low-end severe threats. These low-end severe threats during the day turning into more of an MCS type setup during the night with fairly weak forcing aloft, weaker deep layer shear to support more supercell development, support more MCS development, and more multi-cell kind of cluster development instead of robust, intense, discrete supercells. Although we could see a few supercells in here as well, but we do have the ingredients there to support that kind of daily severe threat going into the next several days. Now, beyond this, it becomes a little bit more bleak, especially if you're a storm chaser here looking to target places in the plains. Let's go to our ensemble models. This is our 12Z GFS ensemble and our 6Z European or 0Z European model ensemble. So this is last night's European model ensemble, which is the most recent model we have in for the Euro, at least that is able to be accessed. But here we are on our 12Z GFS at 500 millibars. So this is taking into account all of the different ensemble members of the GFS. As you recall, an ensemble is just a bunch of different individual runs of the GFS with slightly different individual initial conditions, so that you get slightly different setups, possibly slightly different outcomes or solutions among these individual members, and then you kind of average them together. And this is the average 500 millibar height and wind speed going forward. So this is our morning run of the GFS ensemble. You can see that kind of mostly zonal pattern across the U.S. for the next several days. Some troughing there across the northern plains. GFS is a little bit farther south, at least the ensemble is a little bit farther south, with the troughing here into more of the central plains, whereas some of the other models, the NAM and the European model, as you'll see, a little bit farther to the north. So if we can get a little bit more amplitude to this troughing as the GFS suggests, we may see some more robust severe threat develop across the northern plains into the Midwest and Great Lakes region going into the early and middle portion of the week. But the most important thing I want you to note here is the pattern that occurs after that. We start to get this very high amplitude ridge that develops across the desert southwest into the southern plains. So this is valid on Thursday evening, June 6th. You can see a very robust ridge sets up across the southern plains into the southwest. So that is going to mean a little bit of a shutdown of more robust severe weather across more of the southern plains. Now we do have this robust plume of flow riding over top of this ridge, and this is going to probably indicate the onset of our kind of late spring, early summer MCS season, our northwest flow season across the central plains into the Midwest. Now it's all going to depend on moisture, and we do have some signs that moisture is going to be shunted a little bit farther to the south. So this will all depend on moisture, but this ridge is pretty persistent for quite a while. You see as we go forward into the weekend, into early next week, that ridge really sticks around on the GFS ensembles. Now, the good news for storm chasing perspectives, from a storm chasing perspective, is that this ridge is shifted a little bit off to the west. So it's not this big old death ridge over much of the plains. It's just going to shunt everything well off to the east as far as any robust weather goes. We do have some flow that maintains itself into early next week across portions of the central plains into the Midwest. So if we can get moisture into these regions, we should have several days of northwest flow northwest flow severe weather events going into the next couple of weeks. And that maintains itself for quite a while on the GFS ensemble. Of course, the farther out you go, the less consistency we have among the members. So the farther out you go, take it with a grain of salt, but we do see this ridge kind of persisting for quite a while into at least next week, which could mean more of a severe threat here, of course, pending moisture here across the central northern plains into the Midwest and Great Lakes regions. Kind of your typical late spring MCS northwest flow season. And don't get me wrong, northwest flow has had quite a few potent photogenic events associated with it in the past, especially here across the Midwest. Many tornado events here in northwest flow, but northwest flow does tend to promote more upscale growth in these setups into more of an MCS, perhaps some derecho type systems going into the middle portion of June, rounding the top of this ridge. Let's look at the European ensemble. European ensemble showing pretty much the same thing here. Again, this is last night's European ensemble. So we're going forward, maintaining that mostly zonal flow, just some weak low-end waves moving through the flow. You'll notice here that wave that was predicted on these models here on the European ensemble, a little bit less amplitude, a little bit farther to the north, meaning more of that surface low development here in southern Canada, and that any severe threat with it shunted off to the north. But you can see here on the European ensemble, much of the same as what we saw on the GFS. Again, this is on Friday. Big old ridge develops here across the desert southwest and southern plains. But we still maintain broad troughing here across eastern Canada into the northeast, meaning that we have this pocket of stronger northwest flow in between the two, and that is often a classic sign of northwest flow severe weather events across the northern plains into the Midwest. And again, that persists, just like the GFS, that persists for quite a while into the weekend, into early next week. And so we'll have to see if moisture responds as well, and if moisture responds, we could see some northwest flow events up in that region. Let's see if moisture does stick around here across these regions. So this is your dew point. This is going to be your mean dew point going forward from the GFS ensemble. So you see by the late portion of the weekend into early next week, those 60s dew points, robust moisture all the way up to the Canadian border there. And then we kind of get it to shunt down to the south. Cold frontal push kind of pushes it down to the south, shunts it into the southern plains, going into the middle portion of the week. And that is not super favorable for robust events up here in this region. Very limited moisture across the Midwest. So even though we do have somewhat of the classic skeleton for some northwest flow severe weather events, that moisture going to be shunted well down into the southern plains. So that may be a little bit of a disconnect between where the moisture is and where the strongest flow aloft is. Now let's go into the latter portion of the weekend into next week. So we do see some northward advance of the moisture here across the Midwest on the GFS ensemble by the latter portion of next weekend. This is Saturday evening, those 60 dew points all the way up into the Midwest. And again, keep in mind, this is just the mean dew point. So many members have it to the north up here, that 60 dew point line well to the north. Some are going to have it to the south. This is the average dew point. So we very well could see a solution of more robust moisture return, and we're just going to have to wait and see how things play out. So we go forward into early next week. That moisture kind of does keep surging up there into that region, and that could foster several days of northwest flow severe weather events there across that region, especially as we go looking into perhaps farther down into late next week. We could see that persist with some more moisture down there across a wider portion of the Midwest. So that is just kind of what's going on here, what the models are showing going forward. European model, we'll take a quick look at the mean dew point here going forward, see if it shows some of the same things as the GFS was showing. So once again, that moisture does seem to get shunted down into the southern plains, some with that frontal intrusion deeply down into the southern plains. And then we don't really see as robust recovery as the GFS shows going into next week on the European model. So we're just going to have to wait and see how things play out. We can get an idea from the Supercell composite plots from the GFS ensemble and the CFS, your climate forecast system models. These are taken from the Victor Gensini site from Northern Illinois University. And this basically shows the GFS ensemble supercell composite parameter for week 1, which is going to be this current week that we're in, so May 31st through June 6th. Then we can look at week 2 as well. This is June 7th through June 13th. So the next couple of weeks, this is our supercell composite accumulated supercell composite parameter. So your supercell composite parameter, we don't talk about it a lot on the channel because it is it's just a number. It doesn't really tell us the nuances of the environment. But when looking in the long range, we can use it as kind of a proxy to see where favorable supercell environments may overlap. This supercell composite parameter basically just takes into account where adequate instability and shear, both and deep layer shear, overlap. And so the brighter colors here, the yellows, oranges, and reds, indicate stronger supercell composite, higher supercell composite parameter, perhaps a better chance of seeing supercells in a given region. Of course, this doesn't take into account background forcing, so you can have strong supercell parameter in a certain location with no forcing, and you're not going to see storms. But it does tell us where we have ample overlap of instability and deep layer shear, which are our favorable ingredients for supercells. Moisture as well is factored into that. So this is the GFS ensemble week 1 supercell composite parameter, and we see it's mostly down here into Texas. So and we do see some higher probabilities there across the central and northern plains into the Midwest. So that tells us a couple things. That tells us that we could see some this is, as I said, this is mesoscale season. So you're probably not going to see, if you're looking to forecast tornadic activity in advance, that's just not going to be possible this time of year because this is mesoscale season. We're going to have to wait and see a lot of these tornado setups, if they do happen this time of year, just are not always forecastable well in advance. You're going to have to rely on outflow boundaries from previous night's convection and stuff like that, which are not really forecast well by the models, to see where tornado activity is going to happen on a given day. And so here we're just forecasting supercell composite. That's about the best we can do. So this doesn't really directly forecast tornadic activity, but it does tell us where supercells may occur. And given that we have most of our that kind of zonal flow here across the plains, little perturbations moving through the flow, we may see some of that activity, mostly in kind of that supercell to MCS type evolution here across the central plains. And down here across the Gulf, as these MCSs kind of push down to the southeast, we may see some continuation of that that supercell favorable environment down into the Gulf Coast region there, especially across Texas. It's at least what the GFS ensemble is showing. For week 2, a little bit more of a bleak outline, and this kind of follows what we were looking at on the GFS and European model ensembles. We don't really see any super high bullseyes here for our supercell composite. The best area here looks to be across the northern plains into the Midwest. Again, this is week 2, so June 7th. So basically this coming weekend going into the next week, June 13th. And you see that supercell composite does appear to be most highlighted there across the central to northern plains into the Midwest. That goes well with what we saw on those models, that kind of ridging building in across the southern plains into the southwest, and that stronger belt of flow riding over top that ridge. And any little perturbations in that flow could instigate some northwest flow type events there if moisture is able to get into these regions. That's the question here. If we can get moisture into these regions to interact with this northwest flow and any little perturbations riding over top the ridge, then we could see some severe threat develop there across the Midwest in general. So looking a little bit bleak, especially for the central and southern plains portion of the risk area of the U.S. Let's take a look at the CFS. CFS is just another model, and you'll see how drastically different it is than the GFS ensemble. CFS ensemble for this coming week here is very much highlighted across much of the plains. A little bit lower resolution model is the CFS than the GFS. So it is showing a very broad area of supercell potential across the plains for this coming week. So that does indicate that we may see a persistence of supercell activity across these areas. Once again, mostly initial supercells transitioning to more MCSs and clusters as they move off into the lower elevations of the plains. But we at least are seeing a signal that for this coming week we may have several days of supercell potential, at least across the plains down into the central plains down to the south. Now week 2, you can see how different it is from the GFS. GFS not showing much at all here across the high plains, whereas the CFS is showing a highlight here across the central to southern high plains. Eastern Colorado, western Kansas, down to the east, or down to the south, across the eastern New Mexico, western Texas vicinity. Now that doesn't really jive with what we saw on our models, whereas we have this big ridge over this area, which may suppress activity across the high plains. But if this ridge does shift back to the west a little bit or is not quite as high amplitude as modeled, we may see some additional activity here. This time of year, again, it's mesoscale season. You don't need very big troughs to instigate robust severe weather across these areas. All you need is a little bit of flow, a little ripple in the flow, 30 to 40 knots of flow aloft with adequate moisture, and you're looking at a pretty decent setup for some photogenic supercells in these areas. So we'll have to wait and see. CFS certainly on board with a more central to southern high plains setup in week 2. Whereas the GFS certainly was not on board with that. GFS certainly looks to be more of a Midwest type deal, if anything can get going again, if that the moisture can interact with that northwest flow there riding atop the ridge. Week 3, so this is looking out. The GFS does not go out this far, but we can look here June 15th through June 21st, so the middle portion of June, highlighting here the northern plains. Now, this is not all that surprising. Climatologically speaking, this is our favorite area for severe activity this time of year in the U.S., but at least the CFS is showing some signal here for an overlap of at least decent instability, moisture, and deep layer shear for supercells across the central to northern plains in the week 3 time frame, again toward the middle portion of the month. So take this with a grain of salt. This is not something that is surprising to see this time of year, but it at least is one signal that is showing us that we may see some continuation of activity toward the middle portion of the month across the central and northern plains. So that's kind of what is on the table for the next few weeks. Again, we have severe weather events on the table for the next few days. Today, we have that broad slight risk across much of the high plains there, West Texas northward into Nebraska. Multiple areas of supercell development possible here across the central plains into the West Texas vicinity. Some large hail damaging winds, the most common threats with those storms. And then again, as expected, these storms will kind of congeal into more of a clustered mode as they move off to the east, especially there in southwest Kansas into the panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma, where that severe, perhaps significant wind threat is expected to take place. So that's today. A fairly similar setup tomorrow with convection in organizing into lines here across the northern plains. A little bit of a shortwave moving through in that mostly zonal flow regime up across the central to northern plains. Enhanced risk there for much of Nebraska into northern Kansas, where we could see a robust severe threat develop, particularly a damaging wind threat as storms get going there. And then also that separate area down in West Texas, where we could see a few supercells with mostly a large hail and damaging wind risk. Tornado threat is going to remain low for these areas because we just don't have that support, that low-level shear that we need to support a robust tornado threat. But as we know, mesoscale season, all we need is a little bit of an outflow boundary or something to locally enhance low-level shear, and then we could be in business as far as the tornado threat goes. Then, as we talked about, the cold front, the frontal push kind of shunts the moisture down to the south, and therefore on Monday we will see our severe threat focus there across the central plains, central to southern plains, western Oklahoma, southern Kansas, out to toward the Ohio River Valley region, with a few severe storms expected there. And then beyond that, predictability is just low, but we are expecting to see that ridging kind of build in going beyond the next few days. as progged by our ensemble models. Pretty big ridge building in, which could mean a transition to more of a Midwest type severe weather setup, typical late spring severe weather setups there in the northern to central plains into the Midwest, if we can get moisture to interact with this northwest flow between this ridge and our trough across eastern Canada. So very interesting few weeks ahead. If you're looking to storm chase these next few weeks, don't be alarmed if you see this kind of stuff on the long-range models, a lack of overall supercell potential on some of these models. It is mesoscale season. That means we may not see, if we have a tornado day, it may not be evident until the morning or even in the afternoon of an event. So, but it is that time of year where these setups are mesoscale driven by these kind of mesoscale features. As well as, so we just, you need an outflow boundary or something to take shape, and then you might be in business. But very photogenic season, as we know, lots of storm structure this time of year. So definitely something to enjoy if you're out in the plains at this time. So with that, thanks for watching. We'll be back with any videos as needed if more potent setups develop. But for now, we will leave it at that and see how the models act over the next couple of weeks. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.